American Civil War, brother against brother. Imagine a young man standing in a muddy field in the spring of 1861. He is barely more than a boy. His uniform does not fit quite right. His hands are shaking as he grips a rifle he has only recently learned to use. Smoke drifts low across the grass. Somewhere to his left, someone is screaming. Somewhere ahead, officers are shouting commands that almost no one can hear. Then the cannon fire begins again, heavy enough to shake the ground beneath his boots. And through the haze, he sees men moving toward him. At first, they are only shapes. Then they become faces. One of them might be a neighbor. One might be a cousin. One might be the friend he grew up with. One might even be his own brother. That is one of the darkest truths of the American Civil War. It did not simply divide the country on a map. It entered homes. It divided families at their own tables. It broke apart friendships, churches, marriages, and entire communities. The phrase brother against brother has been repeated so many times that it can sound almost dramatic, almost symbolic. But for many Americans, it was real, painfully real. It meant mothers waiting for letters from sons wearing different uniforms. It meant fathers and sons who no longer agreed on what their country was. It meant sisters praying for men who might one day face each other on a battlefield. Most people learn about the Civil War through the names that fill history books: Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh, Appomattox. Those names matter, but they can also make the war feel distant, like a story told through generals, presidents, and arrows moving across a map. For ordinary Americans, the Civil War felt much closer than that. For them, it was personal before it was military. It began long before the first shots were fired. It began in newspaper arguments, church sermons, and political rallies. It began in tense conversations over dinner. It began in the growing fear that the people next door no longer believed in the same country. And as that fear grew, the United States discovered something terrible. A nation can split over politics, but it can also split over loyalty, belief, memory, and family. This is not just the story of blue and gray armies marching across battlefields. It is the story of a country breaking apart, one home at a time. To understand why the war became so personal, we have to look at the years before it began. By the middle of the 19th century, the United States was growing fast. The country was expanding, the population was rising, cities were growing. New railroads connected more and more of the nation. But growth did not mean unity. In many ways, the North and the South were becoming more different with every passing decade. In the North, industry was expanding. Cities were growing rapidly. Immigration was reshaping urban life. More and more Northerners built their identity around free labor, manufacturing, and the idea that a man should work for himself, not be trapped in a system controlled by slavery. In the South, plantation agriculture dominated wealth and political power. Cotton drove the economy, and slavery stood at the center of that system. Again and again, American leaders tried to delay a final crisis. They negotiated compromises. They drew lines on maps. They balanced free states and slave states. They found temporary solutions and hoped the country could move forward. But none of those solutions fixed the real problem. They only postponed it. Every new territory reopened the same question: would slavery expand, or would it be stopped? And behind that question was an even bigger one. What kind of nation was the United States going to become? By the 1850s, politics had become harder, angrier, and more dangerous. The Fugitive Slave Act outraged many people in the North because it forced them to take part in returning escaped enslaved people. The Kansas-Nebraska Act opened new territories to slavery and led to bloodshed. Bleeding Kansas showed that Americans were already willing to kill one another over this issue. Then came the Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court ruled that African Americans could not be citizens and suggested that slavery could spread farther than many Northerners had feared. Then John Brown attacked Harper's Ferry in an attempt to spark a slave uprising. To some, he was a fanatic. To others, a martyr. But to the white South, he was a warning of what might come next. Trust began to collapse, not just between politicians in Washington, but between ordinary people. Churches split. Political parties split. Newspapers became more extreme. Communities split. Families split. Then came the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without carrying the South. To many white Southerners, that was proof that their political power inside the Union was slipping away. They feared not only what Lincoln might do immediately, but what the future of the country would look like if slavery no longer shaped national politics. South Carolina seceded first, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. These states declared that the Union no longer protected their interests, and they formed the Confederate States of America. When Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861, the crisis became war. Lincoln called for troops. After that, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee also joined the Confederacy. At that point, the choice became real for everyone. Every state had to choose. Every town had to choose. Every family had to choose. And for many Americans, especially in the border states, that choice was anything but simple. The border states showed just how deeply divided the country really was. Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri were slave states, but they did not all join the Confederacy. In those places, loyalty was rarely clear. A man might support his state, but not support secession. He might oppose abolition, but still refuse to leave the Union. He might distrust the federal government, but fear what disunion would bring. He might join one side while his brother joined the other. Kentucky became one of the clearest examples of that divided loyalty. At first, Kentucky tried to stay neutral, but neutrality could not survive a war like this. Kentucky remained in the Union, yet thousands of Kentuckians fought for the Confederacy, and many families in the state were split by that choice. The Crittenden family became one of the best-known examples. One son, George Bibb Crittenden, became a Confederate general. Another son, Thomas Leonidas Crittenden, became a Union general. Same family. Same state, different armies. Missouri was even more violent. Missouri remained in the Union, but that did not bring peace. It brought chaos. The state became a center of guerrilla warfare, local revenge, raids, and executions. In Missouri, the war did not always look like two organized armies meeting in open battle. Sometimes it looked like armed men riding out at night. Sometimes it looked like a farm being burned. Sometimes it looked like a family hiding in fear because someone knew which side they supported. In Missouri, the war became personal in the most brutal way. Virginia tells a different part of the story. When Virginia left the Union, many people in its western counties opposed secession. Their economy, geography, and political outlook were different from those of the plantation East. As the war went on, those counties broke away. In 1863, West Virginia entered the Union as a new state. Even the map itself showed the country breaking apart and reshaping under pressure. But the most haunting examples were often found in ordinary families. Brothers, cousins, fathers, and sons. A brother who had moved south might join the Confederacy because he now felt loyal to his state above all else. Another brother, living in the North, might join the Union Army because he believed the nation had to be preserved. A father might stay loyal to his home state. A son might choose a different path. A woman might marry into a family whose loyalties clashed with her own. And suddenly, politics was no longer distant. It was sitting in the living room. It was at the dinner table. It was inside the family itself. That was part of what made the Civil War so painful. Americans were pulled in different directions at once, toward family, toward hometown, toward state, toward country, toward personal belief. The war forced them to decide which loyalty came first, and no answer came without a cost. For many white Southerners, loyalty to their state came first. They had grown up thinking of Virginia, Georgia, or Tennessee, not just as places on a map, but as political homes they were bound to defend. For many in the North, preserving the Union became the highest cause. They believed the entire American experiment was being tested. If states could simply leave after losing an election, then the country itself might not survive. But there is one truth here that has to be stated clearly. The main cause of the Civil War was slavery. Not just vague differences between regions, not just tariffs, not just hurt pride or political misunderstanding. Slavery was at the center of secession, at the center of Confederate politics, and at the center of the national crisis. That fact matters, because when families divided, they were not only arguing about strategy or states' rights in the abstract. They were being pulled into a conflict over human bondage, political power, and the future of the country. For enslaved African Americans, the war meant something even deeper. It meant the possibility of freedom. At first, Lincoln said his main goal was to preserve the Union. But the war itself changed what that meant. Enslaved people fled plantations, crossed Union lines, offered labor and intelligence, and forced the nation to confront the true heart of the conflict. Then came the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. It did not end slavery everywhere at once, but it changed the meaning of the war. It made emancipation an official Union war goal and opened the door for black men to serve in the Union Army. Nearly 180,000 black soldiers would fight for the Union. Their service helped change the course of the war and the meaning of victory itself. And while many white families were torn apart by political loyalty, black families had already been torn apart for generations by slavery itself, by sale, forced labor, violence, and separation. The war did not erase that suffering, but it opened the door to a different future. Still, inside homes across the country, the war remained deeply personal. Some sons enlisted quickly, caught up in patriotic excitement, and convinced they would be home in a matter of months. Some fathers approved, some begged them not to go. Some families split the moment a uniform entered the house. Mothers waited, wives waited, children waited. Letters became precious, then terrifying. A newspaper casualty list could shatter an entire household in seconds. Women kept farms running, managed businesses, raised children, cared for the wounded, and tried to hold families together while the war pulled them apart. Children grew up surrounded by absence. They learned the names of battlefields before they understood the politics behind them. They saw adults cry quietly. They learned that war was not something far away. It could live in the next room. Even Abraham Lincoln's own family was touched by these divisions. Mary Todd Lincoln came from Kentucky, a border state with deeply divided loyalties. Several of her relatives supported the Confederacy, and some died serving it. So even while Lincoln was leading the Union through its greatest crisis, the war touched his own extended family too. That matters because it reminds us that this conflict was not distant or abstract. It ran through blood and marriage. It crossed parlor rooms and family graves. The battlefield only made that pain worse. The Civil War was fought with weapons more deadly than the tactics soldiers were using. Men still advanced in lines across open ground, even as rifles and artillery had become more accurate and more destructive. The result was slaughter. At Shiloh, Americans were shocked by the number of dead. At Antietam, the country saw the bloodiest single day in its history. At Fredericksburg, men charged again and again into almost certain death. At Gettysburg, entire communities lost their young men in just a few days, and in the wilderness, some of the wounded burned where they fell. Because these armies were made up largely of ordinary citizens, every battlefield loss echoed back into towns, neighborhoods, and homes. A dead soldier was never just a number. He was a son, a husband, a brother, a friend, a farmer, a clerk, a teacher, someone people knew, someone they expected to come home. That is part of what made the Civil War different from many later wars in American memory. The fighting did not feel emotionally far away. It was woven into daily life. Churches split over slavery and loyalty. Communities kept track of who enlisted, who deserted, who changed sides, and who suffered. In some places, people remembered those loyalties for decades. Private life became political in a way Americans had rarely seen before. Who came to your house mattered. What newspaper you read mattered. Which side your son had joined mattered. What you said at church mattered. What you said at the dinner table mattered. As the war dragged into 1864, any hope for a quick and glorious conflict was gone. Union General Ulysses S. Grant put constant pressure on Robert E. Lee's army. William Tecumseh Sherman drove through Georgia, destroying railroads, supplies, and the South's ability to keep fighting. The Confederacy weakened, but it did not collapse quickly. And every extra month meant more death, more amputations, more widows, more orphans, more bitterness. When the end finally came in the spring of 1865, it answered the biggest question of the war. The Union would survive. The Confederacy was defeated. Slavery was approaching its legal end and would soon be abolished nationwide by the 13th Amendment. But military victory did not heal the country overnight. The dead were still dead. Families were still broken. Grief did not disappear because the fighting had stopped. And just days after Union victory, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The country had survived its greatest crisis, but it had not come through unchanged. What followed was Reconstruction, a period of both hope and conflict. Formerly enslaved people tried to build lives in freedom. They searched for lost family members. They built churches and schools. They sought land, safety, political rights, and some control over their own future. For a moment, the future seemed open. But white resistance in the South was fierce. Violence, intimidation, and racial terror made clear that the end of the war had not ended the struggle over what the country would become. And inside many families, another question remained. How do you live with someone who fought for the other side? How do you mourn one son without condemning another? How do you sit at the same table again after a war like this? Some families chose silence. Some chose reconciliation. Some never truly forgave. Some turned grief into memory. Some turned memory into myth. And over time, the phrase, brother against brother, became part of the language Americans used to describe the war. Sometimes that phrase captured something real and tragic, and sometimes it made the conflict sound too neat, as if the two sides were morally the same. They were not. One side fought to preserve the Union and eventually to destroy slavery. The other fought to break the Union and preserve a slave-holding society. That difference matters. But the phrase still tells us something important. The Civil War was not only a military conflict, it was a test of loyalty, a test of identity, a test of what Americans believed their country was, and who counted as fully human within it. It forced people to choose between home and nation, between family and principle, between silence and conviction. And those choices left scars that lasted for generations. That is one reason the Civil War still feels close, even today. Not only because of the scale of its battles, not only because of the names Lincoln, Lee, Grant, and Davis, not only because its photographs still look so immediate. It feels close because it asks a question that never really stops mattering. What happens when political hatred becomes so deep that it breaks the family? In that sense, the Civil War is not only a story about the 19th century, it is also a warning. A nation does not fall apart all at once. First, trust begins to fail. Then compromise starts to look like betrayal. Then opponents begin to look like enemies. And once that happens, the distance from argument to violence can become dangerously short. The American Civil War remains the deadliest conflict in the nation's history, but its emotional legacy cannot be measured only in numbers. It lives in letters filled with grief, in family stories passed down in fragments, in graveyards where brothers lie under different flags, in the memory of a country that nearly destroyed itself. Brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, American against American. That was the Civil War. And to understand it fully, we have to see not only the armies, but the homes they left behind. Because in the end, the war was not fought only at Gettysburg, Antietam, or Shiloh. It was also fought at kitchen tables, in church pews, in county courthouses, in whispered arguments, in unopened letters. In the silence between people who once loved each other without question. The United States survived, but it was changed forever. And maybe that is the most haunting truth of all. When the guns finally fell silent, the country was still facing the same question that had echoed through the smoke from the beginning. What do you do when the enemy has your last name?